I think both corgis are in here.
I am pretty sure both corgis are in here.
Uno.
There's a Benny.
Is he over there?
There's a Stanley. Stanley is directly underneath me.
Cool.
So
hey, everybody.
I think everything's caught up.
Yeah.
Hi, y'all. Welcome to Secular Literary Circle.
I'm
hoping that we are actually caught up. Let us know if we're caught up yet, because that'd be cool.
I am this is the opposite of centered on the screen. But let's see who is here. Tapioca Weasel here is here. Hello, Chris H. Witchy Poo.
Do that.
Witchy Poo is here. You're live.
Yay!
Is here. Very good. Theodicy is an awesome word. I agree. That actually occurs in this chapter.
It
does.
Word
theodicy.
I had to look up that word.
GeoSam is here. GeoSam, I saw you in one of our Discord servers. They're going to say hello. Hatchethead33. Good evening, which I think it's evening for everybody, unless you're in Australia. And if you are, I don't know what time it is. So
I think it's midday in Australia.
Is it? I don't know. I know that Chris is awake because he was tweeting earlier. And Aaliyah Kai, who has been on.
You have been like a streaming monster today.
Yeah, this is like your 5th hour live or something.
Well, I was on for about 2 hours on Circus's channel moderating a debate between him and Michael Moreno, and I'm hoping at least a couple of people who are chilling over there with me, which I'm seeing Witchy Poo was there, and so was Avian Piscean 33. Thank you guys for following me over here. I chilled the living hell out of this stream right afterwards because I'm like, hey, if you need to cool down from all of the debate that was going on, we're going to be talking about biblical history, and I know people on this channel like that stuff. So let's come chill with us, cool down, literally a half an hour from when we ended, we're about to go live again and have some fun for the weekly show here.
Woohoo!
Yep.
I love it. Okay, so before we get into all of the cool Dr. Ermini stuff.
Oh, I forgot to.
This came in today.
It did. It came in. I just saw it when I was out there refilling my coffee cup. Happy last day of Pride, by the way, everybody.
Oh, yeah.
Well, last day of official Pride month.
Yeah, official Pride.
That's important. They decided to say that Black people are cool for 28 days a year and LGBT people are cool for 30. So congratulations. You matter, apparently, to the government.
I beg to differ. I think they're quite cool throughout the year.
Yeah, I know.
So I differ with the government in that sense.
I think it's also Latin Women's Month or something is June, I think, too.
Nice.
Yeah, something like that.
Learn something new today.
Yeah. By the way, just so you know, you're valid all year round and the government's stupid. Yeah, okay, I came in today. All right, I was really happy about this.
I'm so excited about this one. Look at that. It's Vice Admiral Do.
Vice Admiral who? Holdo? Holdo, yeah. 235.
Yeah.
For those of you that can't see it, and
you can sort of
Avian, some
Piscean.
Is it Piscean? Said are already going to watch the, planning on watching anyway. Appreciate that very much.
Yeah, thank you.
But for those of you that don't know what that is, what you just got, that is it's a Funko Pop, and it's a Star Wars Funko Pop. Susan has over, probably pretty close to 175 of them now.
Yeah,
I think. Yep. They're on this wall right here. You can't see them.
And then a whole bunch on them.
Yep. And then they're also behind us and whatnot as well. And we are actually something that we really just started talking about, but I have been considering is that on this channel, besides doing this and besides doing our regular stuff, also doing something, we just had a 30-second conversation about it a little bit ago, actually going through and, because some up here and actually doing going over 10 of them per week or something. That way it'll get us through the whole year. Because not just Star Wars, but I got George Washington crossing Delaware back there. No slaves on that one. Weird that he wouldn't have that, I guess, because he had over 120 of them.
He did. Yeah.
But hi, Allie.
Hi. I still exist here.
Sorry. That is partially my bad. I'm very, very sorry. All right. So this week we have chapter 7. Chapter 7 is entitled "Why Wait for the Resurrection? Life After Death, Right After Death."
Yes, I love that title.
Yeah, that confused me a little bit at first. I was like, wait, what?
Well, we should probably do a very, very brief summary of what we've covered so far, since we do have a few new viewers.
Better idea, yes.
There is a link in the description, by the way, to the book we are reading. There's a lot of stuff that we leave out in the streams and some things that we go deeper into than the book does. Part of the enjoyment of a book club is getting to go into your expertise a little bit and also kind of discussing your reactions to the material. Basically, the thesis of this book, in part, is that the ancient Jews did not originally believe in heaven and hell in any way, shape, or form the way that we conceptualize them, or even an afterlife at all, up until a certain point in history. And the Christian conceptualization, like as you get deeper into it, has a lot more to do with a lot more influences than we are taught in church, so to speak.
Oh yeah.
Quite a few. And, the past 2 weeks have finally gotten into the Jewish concepts of the soul being attached to the body and what happens when you die with your soul.
Mm-hmm.
And this is the Jewish concept as you would find in the Hebrew Bible, which Christians say is part of the Bible. Okay. And have gone in and said, what does the afterlife actually look like? Is there judgment? Is there not judgment? Is there actually this concept of hell and stuff like that? And so it's been a progression up to now, where today we, because we obviously at the beginning of this went through not just Greek or Hellenistic type of concepts of the afterlife, but many other concepts as well. If you frequent Ocean Keltoys channel, we didn't do any Nordic stuff. So
no, that would be cool. But...
And the reason for that being is that it's, first off, there are probably tens of thousands of concepts of heaven and hell from every culture, every society. This one to lead into the Christian version, which you'll find out also has changed over time, focused primarily on what we would see in the Middle East and in the Greek and Roman empires at the time, which made sense.
Well, and we did also cover the Canaanites and the Epic of Gilgamesh from the Sumerians as well, because that did feed into Semitic thought at the time. And he talked particularly about the fear of death that Gilgamesh had and his whole quest to try to avoid it and how he got thwarted out of that.
Yeah.
That was one of the Susaned ones.
Yes.
Yes,
and
it was.
That's why I'm holding the Epic of, or one of the tablets of Gilgamesh in our logo.
14 of them, I believe, altogether.
I believe so.
Yeah. And we are now getting into the end of the Hebrew Bible, which is what that is. But today, not actually getting into anything that's in the Hebrew Bible. And that's very funny if, I think you hear me say it, but then go, wait a second, I thought you said. Yes, the reason for that is because today every single book that we're getting into is an apocryphal book. An apocryphal.
Isn't at least one of the Maccabees in the Catholic Bible though?
It is in the Georgian Orthodox, yes.
Okay.
That you're going to find fourth Maccabees in the Georgian Orthodox. That's not in the. Or is it
I was going to say I thought first and second Maccabees were in the Catholic Bible. If we have a Catholic or ex-Catholic in the chat, please correct me. Yeah. But I could have sworn that they were in the Catholic Bible. I don't think fourth is though.
No, first Maccabees doesn't get into the afterlife, and so that one's not discussed here today. I think actually it is second Maccabee that gets into the Catholic Bible, and fourth Maccabees was written in the second late into the 3rd century, which is why it's so much different from the second book of Maccabees. By the way, there is a 3rd book of the Maccabees, but the 1st and 3rd and the 5th have nothing to do with the afterlife. And we're getting into more Enoch stuff today, as well as a mythological account of Abraham, and even into some Ezra stuff, who some of you may be surprised to know is a guy.
So I did a Google, and 1st and 2nd Maccabees are in the Catholic Church's, the Roman Catholic Church's Bible. So 2nd Maccabees, which we are discussing, is only apocryphal to Protestants. 4th Maccabees is apocryphal to everybody.
Yeah. And apocrypha, by the way, just means that nobody considers it canon, meaning that it is pseudepigraphical or pseudepigraphical, whichever you want to do with that, meaning it's also, or, pseudonymous, meaning that, it's kind of like the Federalist Papers, where Hamilton and John Jay and James Madison wrote them, but they wrote under pseudonyms. Same thing. They didn't claim to be, this is why it's pseudonymous instead of pseudepigraphical, sorry. They didn't claim to be like George Washington or something.
Mhm.
Kind of like what you find in the New Testament, where people will say this is the letter from Paul. Yeah, that's different than what they did with this. So,
as in when you say they didn't claim to be George Washington, as in they didn't claim to be actual people, they used just pseudonyms.
they used Cicero.
Huh.
Yeah, and then it was brother or son of Cicero and something like that. But yeah, nobody that was alive at that time. Yeah. So that's really what we're getting into today, and this is really exciting because you'll find some if you know the history of Christianity and of Christian literature when it comes to heaven and hell, you're going to find there's a lot of similarities.
Oh,
So,
yeah.
yep.
Yeah. So a word that I learned in my reading, theodicy.
Yeah.
I learned that word in reading this book, and I love the fact that I can just learn random stuff like that. Well, not random because it has to do with the book, but, seemingly random stuff that I can learn. So according to the Googles, theodicy means the vindication of divine goodness and providence in view of the existence of evil. Dr. Ehrman sort of asks the question, how is it fair that people suffer and do God's bidding, are never rewarded for it, or those who are evil and wicked actually prosper?
Well, and one could argue that our last week's stream was also on the same question. The answer that those prophets came up with was, well, all of the righteous people are going to be bodily resurrected in this paradise garden, physically, because there's no concept of a soul in the last chapter, really. You're going to be bodily resurrected, and you're going to be awesome, and all the bad guys will be resurrected just to be destroyed.
Right.
We get a slightly different answer to that question in this chapter with the Maccabees books.
Mhm.
Yeah. So they ended up sort of answering the question that, what's going on with it? Is it eventual? What's the point in just having to wait and wait and wait for this eventual, judgment day and resurrection and stuff? So they ended up sort of turning it into, well, the afterlife must actually be directly after death. And it actually definitely, is that the right one? Affected the later formation of the Christian views of heaven and hell.
No, it should be an A. It's
darn it.
It's affected. You're fine.
I tried the A and it told me I was wrong. Effect. It's
Yeah.
Yeah. No. Anyway.
An effect is it's
Yeah. Oh well.
You put the cursor inside of one of the comment sections.
And
I don't care which one.
over here.
I don't care. It's fine.
Yes.
Well, no, like so I can type.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, no, you're good.
There you go.
Because you can still do that while
Yeah.
I'm typing. So.
Yep.
Thank you.
All right. So the transition from, thinking that it was an eventual resurrection to an immediate sort of afterlife, it's seen in the two Jewish texts like we've been talking about that present the same story by different authors that actually lived about 2 centuries apart. The first of them assumes that God's justice will be served on the future day of judgment, while the second says that it happens directly after you die. They were stories about a small group of Jews, 8 of the most famous of the Jewish martyrs, apparently. They were facing torture and death, but still keeping the traditions.
Well, and we should probably go over a little bit about what they were facing torture and death for. So this is part of where my arguments as a Hellenist, when I talk about, there's a reason why I advocate against theocracy. Even in polytheistic societies, this is extremely common in history. They were being tortured and killed because Antiochus decided that he was going to Hellenize the Jewish segments of his ruling area by forcing Jewish people to do things like eat pork or sacrifice to pagan gods that they didn't believe in. And purportedly, according to these accounts, the people who refused to do this were tortured in absolutely horrendous ways, which for the sake of viewership, I'm not going to go too deep into. If you guys want to, you can. But there's some pretty horrendous stuff, being boiled in oil, hands being strung up, like there's bad, not happy stuff.
Tongues being fried alive, things of that nature, Yeah. And the one that got me, I made the note of this because it was the worst one of them to me, so I deeply apologize. It has to do with when women circumcise their infants, and I'm not going to go into any further detail than that if you want to find out about it.
Yeah.
Yeah, you can find out about that yourself. I'm not going to do that.
Yeah, it's in the Maccabees.
Yeah. So, Second Maccabees is really super important. It dates to 124 BCE, and it's a vehement defender of Jewish customs and religion, and it shows how they resisted Antiochus's, quote, attempt to stamp out the Jewish faith with their, they resisted with their piety and their passion.
Mhm.
Piety is a good word. I like
Yeah.
that word.
Yeah, they got their asses beat for a while because, as it turns out, you can't win a war with piety and passion. But then they rose up, and this is also where you get into the end of the 2nd century BCE as well, with the actual changeover into actual like Hasmonean type of stuff.
Mhm.
The Jews then got after Antiochus. The Jews ended up taking back some things, and this leads into the Herodian dynasty in the the 1st century BCE. So there is history in there, and that's the thing I think that people really, there's like this dismissiveness of religious text by people, especially people that are not at all religious, and that all of it has to be, if this is false, then the whole narrative is false. And that's not the case. This is what we get with like people that talk about historical Jesus and not being a myth or whatever. Well, how can you take it from the Bible if it's if the Bible has all this supernatural nonsense in it? Then that means you can't use the Bible for historical stuff. Well, that simply is not true. There is plenty of history in the religious text, no matter if the text even claims to be mythological. There's almost always at least a bit of history in there, and we get that from Maccabees, from Ezra, and stuff like that as well. So, yep,
that's pretty cool.
I actually talked about that at length in my recent Is Zeus a Predator video, which if you guys haven't seen that yet, I worked really, really hard on it. My video on Thursday, by the way, when we do shilling at the end, I reference streams here. So if you guys have not caught up on these streams and you are following my channel, catch up on these streams. I reference stuff we talk about in my newest video. But the Is Zeus a Predator video goes over how Hesiod's Theogony ultimately constructs a theological justification for the structure of Greek society. And we learn a lot about the way that the Greeks viewed certain things through that poem. And so you can find the same thing, even in stories that are not objectively true, quote unquote, whatever the fuck that's supposed to mean. Even in stories that are not historically accurate, you can still find historical details in, at the very least, how certain cultures viewed certain things, because theologically, people tend to justify things that they believe morally or philosophically.
Yeah, absolutely. And you get that, you get that same stuff through like the Pharisees and the Sadducees as you turn the clock over into the times of Jesus and stuff. So absolutely. And that's where a lot of what we call church tradition comes from oral traditions near or part of something that once did happen, for at least part of it. One of the church traditions is that you have in the story of the passion narratives of Jesus, you have Joseph of Arimathea. Mm-hmm. There's a church tradition that he existed, and not just that he existed, but if you've ever heard of the Holy Grail, he is purported to have taken the Holy Grail across Europe and into what is now France and the UK. And this is a church tradition. Right. There are certain parts of this that are true, but how much of it is true is things that we have to look at and actually, like take it apart, while at the same time understanding that these types of mythological claims stem from something. And that's a lot of times what we get in here is with like the heaven and hell stuff. This stems from something else. And so we start to see that.
Well, and when you look at Second Maccabees, Ehrman argues that ultimately the ideas that are put forward, the 4 different examples of torture that are put forward, and the response was basically meant in part, whether it happened physically or not, to illustrate this attitude that, well, you might be torturing us bodily now, but when, God decides to remake the entire universe, or remake the world, physically the earth, and reincarnate our bodies there, well, you're going to get burnt up in a fire, and it's going to suck. And so we then get the transition from Second Maccabees, which takes the earlier account from the earlier stuff that we covered in chapter 6, and starts to look a lot more like the Hellenic view, or as he puts it, the Platonic view, where the soul then becomes more important than the body.
Right, yeah. Trying to get caught up in I just get caught up in like the listening to y'all. And then I'm all like,
the page that we're on page 123 and 124, Afterlife, immediately afterlife.
Yeah, I want to make sure it's in the right space. Cool. Okay. So the Fourth Maccabees used the work of the author of Second Maccabees sort of as a source of the information, but it actually, like you're saying, it conveys like a different ideas and a different purpose in the writing. What they were, less interested in one, more interested in the other part. What I really, really liked was the idea that Ehrman points out of people should use reason, not passion, to guide their actions.
Mm-hmm.
Am I correct in saying that seems like a very Stoic thing?
Yeah, Plato and the Stoics agreed on at least some things. Their conceptualizations of the gods tended to disagree wildly. And for all of you monotheists that may or may not watch in the future and leave troll comments, Plato was not a monotheist. Monotheists like him, but he was not. But that is a very Stoic view. It's actually a very Hellenic view in general, with the exception of the Epicureans. The Epicureans very much valued bodily pleasure above many other things. Mm-hmm. However, like the Stoics, that is a Stoic argument that you should use reason rather than allowing yourself to be ruled by your initial impressions and the emotions those impressions. You should rather create a narrative about your life that is more conducive to functioning in a fair way. In other words, you don't have to believe everything you think.
Mm-hmm. I like it.
Mm-hmm.
The more I hear about that stuff, the more I like it. The Stoic stuff.
Yeah, Stoicism's pretty cool.
Yeah, I like it. Okay, so Fourth Maccabees does show the shift in the Jewish thinkers' thought processes around this time, since it was about 2 centuries after Second Maccabees. That stuff wasn't going to happen on Judgment Day, but it was immediately after death. It tells the same story of the 7 brothers and their mother, but it focuses on the soul mattering rather than the body, like I said a little bit ago. Bodily torments are temporary, but the soul of those who disobey God will be tormented in the afterlife forever. Damn, Ehrman's poetic.
Mm-hmm.
Love it.
Yes.
I'm always going to say how much I love that stuff. It also really focuses on the vengeance and wrath that God will rain down on the persecuting tyrant. In 4th Maccabees 18:22-23, for these crimes divine justice pursued and will pursue the accursed tyrant. But the sons of Abraham with their victorious mother are gathered together into the chorus of the fathers and have received pure and immortal souls from God. So there's no need to wait for a future resurrection when you get all your rewards and punishments right after you die.
Yeah, and that is a new concept.
Yeah.
There, and now important again to note that 4 Maccabees is in the 2nd century CE, and so they have had time at this point to really ingratiate themselves with the Hellenistic traditions and understandings, as well as these folks also would have known about or even had conversations with, especially prior to 70, the Jewish followers of Jesus who would become, in the late 1st century, the Christians. Mm-hmm. And so
we could call it a Jewish messianic cultus at that point, because that's effectively what it was.
Oh yes. Yeah, they didn't gain any type of separation necessarily from Judaism until the late 1st century. So like Paul and Cephas and James and the leaders of the church, they were still Jews, and they called themselves Jews. Turns out, by the way, so did Jesus. So the switch wasn't until like the end of the 1st century, and even then they were a fledgling cult. So
Well, and I would like to point out that we've been talking about the Apocrypha here. Again, Second Maccabees, if you grew up Catholic or you know a Catholic, that ain't Apocrypha for them, but they call it the Apocrypha for, evangelicals because they don't consider it canon. This book, in our very first stream, we talked extensively about two apocryphal books. One of them was the Acts of Thomas, and the other one was it was like the Revelation of, I can't remember her actual name now. But the point is both of them gave us an idea of where some of these ideas, even before the Divine Comedy came, of what heaven and hell looks like. Porphyria, I think, was her name or something. But I don't actually remember. Yeah. But it shows, and these books show that just because they're not considered canon, it does not mean that they were not widely read during a certain period of time among the intellectual elite, and it does not mean that through osmosis they did not affect culture and cultural understandings of certain things. Just because they weren't officially religiously sanctioned does not necessarily mean that they are not influential, and that's part of where I think this book is so wonderful at bringing that to the forefront.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and a great example of this, because they're known as Apocrypha, and then become apocryphal books, and together they're known as the Apocryphon. So that's fun. The one of the ones we spoke about in our first episode, especially first episode overall, and regarding this, is the Apocalypse of Peter.
Right.
The Apocalypse of Peter is the precursor, of course, to Dante's Divine Comedy, mm-hmm. and was biblical. It was in the canon until the 4th and 5th centuries, when it was replaced by the Apocalypse of John. And so when you say that it had an impact on culture, absolutely.
Yeah.
Perpetua. That was the person I was looking for.
Yeah.
I went back
Yeah. And of course, been talking to Tapioca Weasel a little bit about what Apocrypha would be considered in the, in the Bible, or what they would have said is Apocrypha versus what they would have said as canon. And to answer your question, they chose.
They did. It was a few different councils, right?
Yep. There were seven ecumenical councils.
There were a bunch of different councils.
Yeah. The ecumenical councils. The first one was in 325 CE, after Constantine. He was like, I don't care if Jesus is a god and he was born a god. I'm a Christian just because it's politically, like Donald Trumpish for me to be a Christian. So you guys go figure it out. And also, you down there in Alexandria, stop being you and go do your. It was the Arian controversy. Is what the first ecumenical council in 325 was about. Arian, not the Hitler version. His name was Arius. So
I want to point out that I was going to make a joke that's not quite as funny now, but it's still really funny because I didn't want to interrupt you.
Good.
So you said you have the Apocrypha. They are apocryphal. And they make up the Apocryphon.
Uh-huh.
And then you said, so that's fun. And I was going to say, Apocryphon.
And then...
Tapioca Weasel has this brilliant pun in the chat, hooked on apocryphonics. Which reminds me, back on the subject, we actually have another apocryphal book that we take a look at in chapter 7, and that's the book of Ezra.
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
Well, there are
fourth Ezra.
Yeah, there are multiple Ezra books. Yeah, because that's important, because an Ezra actually makes it into the Bible. So,
we're looking at the fourth book of Ezra, apparently.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Which he says is pseudonymous. It's a description of bizarre and symbolic visions given to a famous holy man of Jewish antiquity, meant to explain the heavenly secrets that can make sense of the horrible situations facing people on earth. So the idea being, I guess, that Ezra, the angel Uriel, grants him a bunch of apocalyptic visions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Do we have a Susan version of this, or are we going to kind of just try to go through it together?
I'm trying to find where I went through that. I don't think I have a Susan version of it.
I am surprised when we get this narrative. There's usually a Susan version of it.
I know. Yeah. I'm really disappointed because I just sort of have like very, very bare bones notes on that part instead of actual Susan version. I'm a little disappointed in myself.
Yeah.
Well, and what's really interesting is when you're talking about the Odyssey, like that is the Odyssey is this is the chapter that I think, or at least this book is the one that tries to address that the strongest. Like there's this very, I would argue, ineffective, because like eternal punishment for a finite crime is very off in terms of morality, but this is where you first start to see it getting defended, according to the author.
Yeah, and this makes sense because of when it was written. It claims to be, back in the 6th century BCE, and it claims that's when it was written, around the time that the Babylonians came in and they were like, "Hey, they're wiping out Jerusalem and everything," but it's not.
Yeah, it was actually a full 600 years later.
Yeah, written around the same time as you'll get some of your Apocrypha of the Maccabees.
It was actually aimed at the people during the time it was written, rather than supposedly being aimed at the people 600 years prior.
Yes. Yeah. And
So this is where we also start to shift the focus, as Ehrman points out, from the nation being resurrected as righteous versus the individual being resurrected. And not only that, but for Ezra, he argues that this is also where we start to see that there's going to be a lot less people that are quote unquote saved than there are people that are going to burn and eventually perish. And like Ezra apparently in the book expresses, or through the author expresses concern about this, like how could that possibly be fair? And like he basically, there's this justification that the other nations are nothing, they're like spittle compared to their abundance from a drop in the bucket. And then later you get, as the spirit leaves the body to return again to he who gave it, it is one of these that has shown scorn and not kept the way of the Most High, who have despised his law, who have hated those who fear God. Such spirits will never enter into good habitations, but will immediately wander about in torments. So you get this justification that, oh, well, they were jerks in their life, and there's a lot more of them than there are of you, and that's why there's going to be so fewer saved, because, well, like Yahweh can't be concerned with all of those other nations. They were jerks. Like they don't deserve that consideration.
Yeah, so it's actually pretty close what you get. To answer your question, Tapioca Weasel, Daniel, the last book of Daniel would have been, or the last part of Daniel would have been written in the 1st and 2nd centuries BCE. This is at the end of the 1st century CE. So after the death of Jesus, about the time that you would have actually found the writings of Paul, as well as maybe the book of Mark. This was written after the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem in 70 CE. That ended the Jewish Roman War. And we know about that obviously because of Josephus. This actually helps to provide, even though it's apocryphal, this helps to provide some historical context and validity to what Josephus wrote in both Jewish antiquities and Jewish wars. That's cool. And this one being written around the same time, when you look at them, even though this one says, this is in the 6th century BCE, you look at it, it's like, wow, this perfectly matches with what Josephus said. So, and also the temple didn't look like, this is the Herodian temple versus what you're trying to say. Not the same thing, bucko. So
well, and this also is our first mentions of any sort of thing like heaven, right? Like we get this idea that the soul, when separated from the body, the righteous, it says they will be made like light unto the stars and be incorruptible from then on. And then we get a much more concise description of a physical sort of pseudo heaven in the Testament of Abraham, which is the next section of the book.
Yeah. And I do want to state one thing is that in some writings regarding what Jesus would have said or what Paul would have said or some of the other apocryphal Peter stuff, you actually get this saying that wide is the road to destruction and many are on it, and narrow is the road to, it doesn't say heaven, but it says to life.
Right.
These individuals would have had either access to this type of writing or would have been part of these type of sects that are separate from the actual teachings of Jesus. And that's important because this is Semitic language, right? That Jesus did not purport to say. So this the way they come together, even though it's apocryphal, is actually really, really cool because it weaves an amazing historical story.
Nice.
Yeah.
That's
but yeah, this is the first time we get to see hell and what it's or heaven, what it's like.
Nice.
Well, and what's interesting is the echo of heaven in the Testament of Abraham brings us back to that first chapter a little bit, though he doesn't point it out. It sounds a heck of a lot in some ways like that, like the idea of heaven for martyrs that we talked about in the first chapter. Mm-hmm. So that's like Perpetua's story. So that's also, again, you see the way that these like histories sort of weave together. It shows how they influenced each other. And it also shows, as Ehrman points out, how the Hellenistic views in particular influence the Jewish ones and how they syncretize them, which is fascinating.
Yep. And something that you'll see here is that so in this story, I do recommend, by the way, reading the Testament of Abraham. It's not as old as Abraham would have been, so it's actually rather new. But it's definitely, as mentioned, has Hellenistic writing inside of it and style. Because Abraham at this point is like 995 years old, right? Because back then, you lived longer. Back then, not now. Yeah. And so Gabriel comes down and he's like, hey, you gotta die. Like, this is just like a thing that's gotta happen. Abraham's like, Elijah doesn't, so no, I don't. And
Peggy.
And Peggy.
So are we getting our first Nathaniel version of a story? Like, this is exciting.
Well, kind of, because I'm going to pair it with something that actually happens in the New Testament.
So then, yes.
Yeah, kind of. And so Abraham is, if you remember, like Abraham, Isaac, things like that, they're the folks that actually wrestled with God, right? So if you read the book of Genesis, he ends up wrestling with God, and this is actually where the term Judah and Israel and all that stuff comes from when Jacob wrestles with God, and that's the son of Abraham, mm-hmm. right? And Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and all that stuff, right? And what you actually get is that Abraham also recognized that Gabriel, when he came down to hang out with them, to take him basically to die, was Gabriel, the angel. And so he actually tried to trick him, and he said, hey, Gabriel, or whatever your name you told me is, I forget what he actually says in the writing, I have just happened to make some dinner, and you should come and stay. And Gabriel, if you know anything about angels, is that they don't eat. Because why would you have to?
It's like the Metatron in Dogma.
Yes, exactly.
The book says
angels are ill-equipped.
Oh, is it Mike? Oh, yeah, it is Michael. I thought it was. I was saying Gabriel for. Thank you. Sorry.
Michael.
And he also doesn't. Yeah, he also doesn't have any appendages, and that's
like a Ken doll.
That is made clear also in the book of Genesis when it comes to Sodom and Gomorrah, which is how you know that it couldn't, whatever. And it's funny how it skips over the fact that he didn't eat, but Abraham ate, and it was all okay.
Yeah, it's totally normal.
Yeah, he's like, nah, I just had dinner, And so Michael ends up taking.
I prepared a feast for myself.
Yes, it's awesome. It's like Thanksgiving, and it's going to be me. I'm thankful for me, and and he ends up getting like he said, okay, I want to show you the, he's like, he pulls like an Aladdin on her, on her Abraham. And he's like, I'm going to show you the world. Right. And he gets in a chariot. This is very, very Hellenistic. Right? He gets in a chariot and he flies up into
that is very Apollon.
Yes. Oh yes. The person that wrote this. And he flies around with Michael, and he can see, he enters what is known as the first heaven. Yeah, you get it now. Yep.
I get it.
The gates open. He goes into the first heaven, and before he gets there, he can actually see. He sees all the people down on the earth. Not all of them, but he sees a good number of them, and he realizes they're all practicing iniquity. This is also a reference to God or Yahweh prior to the flood, when he says of the people that darkness was in them all the time, and all they ever thought about was evil. And this is actually, it's not a reference to actually people, but rather a reference to the Nephilim, but whatever. And
the Nephilim.
Yeah. And Abraham is like, man, these people are awful. Yo, Yahweh, you know that whole Sodom and Gomorrah thing? Would you mind? And Yahweh's like, for sure, bro, I got you. And he like throws down fire and brimstone. You know, did Yahweh stuff, basically. These the things that he normally does, right? And asteroids, I guess. Dinosaurs are dead now.
Aw.
And
Why
Abraham
did you have to invoke Kent Hovind into this? Leave Kent Hovind and Kent Ham. They can just go somewhere else for a minute.
I'm just saying.
Okay, so now I've got the headcanon that chariot was being drawn by pterodactyls, and you will not get it out of my head, and there was nothing you can do to stop me.
Fair enough. Pterodactyls aren't dinosaurs, so I'm okay with that. And yes. And Abraham at that point is like, he's like, God damn, seriously, God damn. You're
Why
like,
you do the damn?
He's so many people are dying that Moses or Abraham at this point is like,
the fuck, dude.
also, what? Stop. Because he starts feeling this anguish in his body, and he's like, I cannot take this anymore. You got to stop murdering people. My bad. Which is actually kind of funny because he has to say my bad because he like commands Yahweh to do it.
Mm-hmm.
He's like, murder these motherfuckers. And Yahweh is like, all right. I mean, he's not kind of been pent up anyways. Mrs. God isn't giving it, you know. And so they enter the first heaven. And the first heaven ends up being what would be considered torment or punishment for those workers of iniquity. And he actually sees their souls in torment, being tormented. It's not like what you see in the book of Revelation, the Apocalypse of John, but you see, you actually do see people going into this place where they would be punished before being judged later to be punished. And then basically Michael takes him back, and he doesn't actually get to see the other one.
Punishment at this point.
Say again.
I said we're in punishmentception at this point because earlier conceptualizations were like, yeah, you're not going to be destroyed if you died for your sins, like as a punishment in your life, like you're fine. And then this is like, oh no, you're still going to suffer. Yeah.
And you can actually see some stuff, you know, Abel is also on the judgment seat, if you will, of God. So, you know, Abel, the one that was murdered first on the planet by his brother, who then would have had to have all the sex with his mom. These things are real. And he ends up taking that. There is another stuff does happen, by the way, but it goes to like evaluations and stuff. As Tapioca Weasel mentioned, a most bitter place of judgment. And by the way, there are trumpets and stuff like this that happen. So if you're reading the Apocalypse of John, there are a lot of things here that make sense and that you'll find correlation. And then he goes back, and for whatever reason, Michael doesn't actually like kill Abraham, and he takes him back to his house, and then the angel of death actually shows up. All right. And he's like, all right.
You forgot the other two layers of judgment, though, because that is something that's mentioned in this last paragraph. So in this idea of the heavens, there's actually 3 layers of judgment that you go through. Not just one. It's not just you're sitting in front of God. No, you get judged by Abel, and then you might get punished there for a bit and cleanse yourself. And then you're going to get judged by all of the faithful of Israel. Then if you get punished, all of them. And if you get punished from there, then you'll have one last chance after that to get judged by God. And from that, there's no court of appeals. You're fucked if he decides you're still screwed, even after you make it through the other 2.
Yep, exactly. And
Abraham, then we get to God.
Yeah. Yeah. And at that point, then you are, there is no way for you to be able to find redemption. And this ends up being something that we see in Christianity minus the other things.
Yeah.
There is, and we'll see this later on, but whenever in Christianity, whenever we die, we're not immediately judged, right? But we are immediately judged.
Yeah.
Because and this is where we get also the ideas of purgatory and stuff like that. If you are of Catholic descent or the Catholic persuasion, these ideas of purgatory, like what happens between death and when the final judgment comes, right? Whenever the trumpet sounds and all that stuff. And a lot of that is written in here. because you see that there's judgment before judgment. And there is when you consider that, how can I be judged now if I'm already dead, and then judged later if I'm already dead and already have been judged?
Yeah.
Right. It's difficult to wrap one's head around.
Yeah.
Which is why purgatory is such an easy answer.
Really
it's like
is.
you're just waiting. You're just asleep and you're waiting. And by the way, Christian apologetics, because it's historical, this is where we get the ideas of Christian heaven and hell. It doesn't mean we believe it. We just study it.
Yeah.
And
this is a book.
Well, in the chat, just as you noticed that, I wrote, because being educated doesn't depend on belief, and the predominant thought in our society is that it's true. So understanding the origins of that can help us deal with the ramifications of it.
Yeah. And to further and foster polite, as much as you can, polite, respectful, passionate conversation with those who may not know or hold a different belief. This stuff is not whether or not God is real, right? That's not what we're discussing here.
Yeah.
And
this is coming
which, by the way, the three of us all have slightly different answers to that question. Because I can grant that Yahweh is real without wanting to engage praxis in him as a pagan. For those of you who didn't know that that's what I am.
Yep. Yes. One thing I did want to mention about this, the levels of heaven and stuff. In the New Testament, you have Paul, who of course is from Tarsus, which is a Greek city not in Palestine, right? Paul in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, I believe. What?
Is his last name up?
Are you moving on to the next section?
No, I'm not.
This is related, but not.
No, because this talks about you see the connection with Hellenism here.
Yes, and I was going to mention one last thing before we break down the connection with Hellenism, which was that the last bit in this section, the torments of the sinners, it's not absolutely clear that they last forever, according to Ehrman. But the rewards are said to. And that was the last thing I wanted to mention before we move on to any sort of asides.
Oh, yeah. I was just going to mention why it's connected to Abraham going to the first heaven.
Oh, go ahead.
Because there are 4 heavens, right? This is the idea that there are 4 heavens. This comes from far before any type of Jewish mythology, Jewish history, Jewish belief. This comes from many other religions prior to that, but there are 4 levels of heaven. And the 4th level of heaven is, if you read the book of 2 Corinthians, Paul talks about going there. He says, I go to he mentions it like in the 3rd person. So, like I had a friend, but you wouldn't know him because he's from Canada type stuff. And he's the one that did this. And he knows a lot of things, but he can't say these things. And, if you kind of wink type stuff.
Not I swear.
And he talks about going to the 4th heaven and actually having a conversation with God. And this is an exact parallel to what we're seeing here with Abraham as well. Mm-hmm. The two are intricately connected, much like the other stuff, and we see them from their pagan roots all the way into quote unquote monotheistic roots or monotheistic beliefs today. And you get from the angels are in a different heaven than Jesus and God.
Right.
And according to this, Abel's not mentioned in the other stuff, but it also says that paradise is not what one would consider, but rather to be considered as Eden. Right. And this is really, really cool how it's presented when they're all put together. So I wanted to mention that as something that the connection with Abraham and Paul. Paul is great. So go ahead. Sorry.
Well, just one tiny little thing I was going to point out that I thought was really, really entertaining was the concept of like the writing down the good things you've done, the writing down the bad things you've done, and then they're taking the calculation and doing judgments based on that.
Yeah.
It reminded me so much of The Good Place.
Yeah. Way to steal
so
that
much.
Concept, Good Place.
I was just Abraham.
It's also very Platonic. Plato had a lot of those ideas. In fact, he believed that if your good was and your virtue was high enough that you could yourself become a daimone or a helper spirit to the gods and achieve a kind of immortality.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah, and that's also that's imparted to Abraham, Isaac, Elijah, and there's one other.
And Peggy?
3 days, everybody. But also Enoch, depending on your interpretation. There it is.
So, which brings us to, what did Jewish people believe at the time of Jesus? Which he brings up something that he brings up repeatedly through this whole thing, especially in the section we did on the Hellenistic afterlife, which is that we have a very hard time knowing what the common people believed because they weren't educated enough to tell us. So, and we don't know how much we can trust the elites, who are the ones primarily providing us with our written sources about what the common people believed. Like Greeks in particular love dunking on the common people. It's a thing that happens all the time. Plato in particular really liked to dunk on what he called the superstitious people, and Cicero did something similar. But he talks a little bit about the various sources that we do have and the ideas that we could get from them. And this is where Josephus comes in.
Yeah. So what we have, and Josephus is actually near the end of this to really kind of pulls it all together in this instance as well. But so what we have, the only way that we can really get this stuff, because most of the folks at the end of at the turn of the century, let's say it that way, you have the language that was written was Greek. No matter your level of Greek, there are different types of Greek that have been written, but it was Greek. The majority of folks who would have been in Palestine at this point, and you're talking more than 90%. So when I say majority, it's like, the percentage of white people in Iowa versus everybody else. And yes, Tapico Weasel, exactly. Jesus was probably illiterate, at least when it comes to Greek. He would have spoken Aramaic. And that's what his disciples would have as well. It was a language of the people, of the common people, and they would have spoken Aramaic. But there was almost nothing below a fisherman, by the way. And because
Jesus very well could have potentially been able to read like Hebrew, though, considering the fact that he apparently outwardly was a rabbi, which means he would have had to at least be a little bit literate, maybe.
Yes, not in Greek though.
Yeah, I was saying in Hebrew he might be.
Yeah.
Possible, yes. And so if you have 90+% of the population can't read Greek, then you also have even higher than that percentage, so a fewer number of people can't write it.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is the language that you use at the time. I think it's the Vitae, it's the language Vitae or something like that.
And it's important to note that those who could, it was expensive private tutors and not like schooling programs. There was nothing like education like what we understand it today. If you wanted to learn, you had to be rich enough to hire a private tutor to come in and teach you, and probably from a young age. So when we're talking about the wealthy elites, we're talking the 1%, like here.
Yeah, it's definitely the amount of people who could read are about 5 to 8%. Lower than that, around 3% probably could write it. And then could write prose, like what we see, especially in Luke. Oh my gosh. Hellenistic Luke, read that book. Right around 2% maybe. And so we have the graves of hundreds of thousands of Jewish people from around this time, around the turn of the century, all the way back to, 100 BCE, up into like after the death of Jesus. And most of those, more than 90%, and this makes sense, they're indistinguishable. They have no writing on them. We don't know who they would have been. We can obviously, archaeologically figure out certain things, but we don't know anything about what they would have believed. Mm-hmm. Because usually what we get, like on our headstones or whichever, if you have a grave, it'll say something like, if you go to Arlington National Cemetery,
right,
you'll have the Star of David, you'll have a cross, you'll have the crescent moon and star, and then there's pagan symbols as well. There's also stuff for like atheism, by the way. I think it's just like a circle. No, it's nothing. It's a circle or something like that. And we don't have that for over 90% of them.
Yeah.
And so it makes it even more difficult to say, and because they didn't write, and because they were incapable of providing anything, headstone or otherwise. What did they actually believe? This gets into the folks, the Essenes, the Essenes were up north of Galilee,
Mhm.
on the Sea of Galilee, north of where Jesus would have been born. The Essenes wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls. So if you've heard of those, or if you've heard of the National Bible Museum, right? Good job, Hobby Lobby, getting your totally authentic and not stolen Dead Sea Scrolls.
Oh, Hobby Lobby.
They wrote about what the beliefs were, at least where they lived at that time, which is then paralleled with what Josephus writes about what Pharisees, more than anybody, Jesus would have been one for the most part, Paul certainly was, Jewish Pharisees would have believed, and Sadducees kind of. And so that's how we take these 5% of headstones that we're actually able to say went on to wherever, the afterlife or some crazy stuff, right? Which, again, very few examples of this. And we say, okay, this is what this says. What the hell does this mean? And then we get stuff from the Essenes, and then we get stuff from Josephus. And this is all the writings we have, by the way, in the 1st century for Palestine.
Well, and Josephus, like Ehrman particularly points out that Josephus is all we have pretty much of the Sadducees, though they were the real power players. There's no writings of them whatsoever, but Josephus is extremely clear on one point, and that was they did not believe in any kind of resurrection or afterlife whatsoever. They held to the traditionalist, ancient Israelite prophet, the death, the grave, Sheol is the end, full stop.
Yeah, and that is the... If you've been kind of keeping up with us, that is the Jewish tradition. That has been the body goes into the ground, the soul goes to Sheol, you're done, you're asleep. And that's very telling for what we get from Jesus, and like, because that's the next chapter that we actually get from that. Which it is kind of interesting, though, that the Sadducees don't have any writing because they were still mostly important at the time of Jesus. The Sadducees would have been those, if you remember the Passion narratives, that they are the ones that convicted him of his crimes. And
though that council would not have been possible to have had on the day that they claimed it, and there's a lot of shit. You've covered that on this channel before. If there's a link that anybody can grab, I'll grab it. But
yeah,
I know you've covered this at least on your Periscope streams and on here before.
Oh yeah. But they also were they were elected for the most part. You had the high priest and stuff, and who they spoke with were the people who were the Romans in charge in Jerusalem, and Jerusalem wasn't the capital at that point, mind you, as well, or either. They just where they went because they lived in the holy city, and so the Sadducees had a lot of power at that point. They were declining in power, and we definitely see that by the Jewish war with the Romans, but it's very interesting to me, nonetheless, that there is nothing really written about them, about what they believed for being so powerful.
I can actually explain that a little bit. At least in the Hellenistic view, quite often things that were done, quote unquote, in the usual way or considered to be the typical belief were actually very rarely mentioned in ancient writings. For example, it has been a bitch and a half to reconstruct a lot of typical household worship practices because whenever they are referenced as the phrase in the usual way in Greek. So if you look at it from a Hellenized perspective, it would actually be more likely that the predominant view would not be recorded.
Yeah, and that would make sense as well. I like Tapico Weasel. It's not the capital now. You're correct. It's unfortunate, actually, that most people think it is. Well, I mean, the president did move it there or whatever. You can't do that, dude. It's not your country.
So we get to the point where basically Ehrman says what you just said, which is Jesus was a Pharisee and very much held to the doctrine of resurrection, probably bodily resurrection, rather than that of the soul. Maybe, I don't know.
It's
kind of messy with Jesus because Paul makes a lot of assertions that Jesus doesn't seem to, at least if you go by the earliest of the accounts of his life.
The stuff from Paul is like spiritual resurrection, right? Or was Paul bodily?
It's both.
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 I thought Paul himself was one or the other.
I once considered that, so you might have gotten that from me.
Paul seems to syncretize the two.
Yep. He said so. It is a resurrected body, but it is without blemish. It is without anything that we have incurred, and it also has the cleansed, resurrected soul within the body. And this is dualism. It's quite a fairly unique, at least in Palestine.
Yeah.
And yet that's what Paul actually believed would happen, which is kind of funny when you read the Passion narratives. But Paul also says, I did not receive this from man,
right,
but rather through a vision, basically.
Yeah.
And so he says, if anybody tells you anything different, they're lying to you. Says that.
Well, and since we're kind of in the wrap-up portion, by the way, next week we are finally going to be talking about Jesus himself and his teachings of the afterlife, but we're only in chapter 8 out of 14. So we're halfway through the book. Just getting into Jesus and what he taught, Paul changed a lot of things, and there were a lot of apocryphal writings after that changed the predominant view and constructed the narrative we saw today. So we are nowhere close to done. We are only halfway in. I actually want to shill my next video that's coming out on Thursday. It premieres at 6 p.m. PST, 9 p.m. EST. I am going to talk about, on that video, granting the idea that the Bible is divinely inspired from a polytheistic view and seeing where that takes us on the search for truth. There may be a follow-up to it talking about the obsession with biblical inerrancy in the church and the history of that, but I decided to leave that out of this video just because the argument that I make, I think, is strong enough without it for now. But one of the interesting things that I point out that I think is going to get into in this book as well is that the New Testament also introduces a brand new concept, that of the pneumatos, or the Holy Spirit, which I argue in that video something very similar to what you talked about last week, Nathaniel, and I credit you with this. We don't actually know that this is not one of God's adversaries from the Old Testament, the Satans, that did this. So if you guys are interested in that sort of history and a Judaic viewpoint and why a lot of Jews did not end up becoming a part of this cultus, and some arguments as to why that might have been, that's going to be a fun video for you guys, and it heavily references the work that we've been doing on this stream. Like about half of my references in there come out of this book and our discussions here. So if you guys are enjoying the series that we're doing here, that video very heavily draws from it, and I think you guys are going to really enjoy it too.
Yeah, sure. We're excited for that. Should note this at the end of this chapter. I forgot to notice it, and I looked over and I saw that it was still on the screen. I appreciate that. They thought the Jews at the end of basically the turn of the first century, the belief, this was an apocalyptic belief, that the end of the world was coming very soon, maybe tomorrow. Mm-hmm. Hi, evangelical Christians, and that the judgment would come into the world, and at this point that they would actually inherit the planet,
right?
Not
heaven
up there. This is where the fourth heaven becomes the idea of Eden. Right, that is still the case.
Yeah,
it's not anything that's spiritual. So important to note that moving into next week because of what Jesus also believed. Yep. So I know I had to go back to that. Sorry, I meant to mention I didn't. But yes, very excited for your video on Friday. We're still trying to
Thursday.
Yep, that too. We're still trying to get a video out here very soon.
Yeah, the BLM video sounds like it's going to be one hell of a project. I contributed voice for that, by the way. So if there's anybody that hangs out from our Discord, like I'm in it, and there's a lot of other people that you're probably a fan of that are in it too. These guys work incredibly hard on their stuff. Like I've been hearing all kinds of everything about the toil of putting this thing together and the sheer amount of reading they've been doing. Just so y'all know, it's getting announced on our Discord. Like this is going to be something chilled out. They work their asses off on this stuff, and there's a message in here. I have absolute faith that you guys are going to need to hear. I trust these two when they say that they've put the work in.
Aw, thank you.
Yeah. It's a bunch.
Yeah. So let's see. What else do we have to? Oh, we're going to be on Xenia Bridge next Monday.
Yes, you guys are. Jen Aldrich and I are going to be interviewing the two of you about coalition building, BLM, and why you chose to work with a dirty pagan.
I love it.
There you go.
I'm excited.
And something that we have failed to mention on our channel here is we do have a Patreon.
We do have a Patreon.
We don't tell you about that for you to give us money because we want your money. Although, sure, we tell you that because we started our channel a year ago in May, And that was when we started making videos. If you want to see our first videos, there's like 25 of them or something.
They
are, you can be a Patreon subscriber and you can see them.
Yeah. It's interesting.
There's incentive for you.
Yeah, you can give us as little as $1 a month.
Yep.
So that's pretty awesome. I should have had a list of patrons ready to go. I didn't.
I think Tapioca Weasel is one of them.
Well, and I know that you guys get the full, like, Adobe Suite to be able to edit your videos well, and I can tell everybody here that the full Adobe Suite is extremely expensive every month. Your guys' contributions are directly going to their channel and keeping the upkeep, and they'll probably even help upgrade the StreamYard so that this particular show will have a better experience coming into the future. Like, I've got an intro that I've been working on, and we can't use it until they get enough to be able to upgrade. So if you guys are willing to help out, even if you just care about this show and nothing else, which, by the way, you're dumb if that's the case, go check out the rest of their stuff. They're some of the most well-researched things that I have seen here on YouTube. Like, their scholarly approach is fantastic. The atheism news and stuff that they have done on past streams is fantastic. Susan did an amazing deep dive into particularly gay conversion stuff that I shill out frequently. And Nathaniel has done some fantastic work on debunking various myths related to, mythicism and, other misconceptions that a lot of people in the secular community have. Like, if you enjoy learning over arguing, this is your channel, and you, if you've got the means, please help support them. Like, there's a reason that I asked them to do this show instead of anybody else. Like, they do a fantastic job, and you should check out the rest of this channel.
Aww.
No, definitely appreciate that.
Thank you.
Make sure you go subscribe to her channel too. It's really important.
It's like,
is over here. Is she
that way?
Over there. There it is.
There we go.
Yeah.
Subscribe to Leah Kai too. You can find links for all of our stuff. You can find links to our Twitter. You can find links to Leah Kai's channel and her Twitter on there. You can also find the link to, if you would like to purchase Dr. Ehrman's book, Heaven and Hell. You can find a link to the Simon & Schuster website on there. We also have a link. If you like our avatar that's in our logo, you can go commission Gaelic Nox and they'll do something for you.
Yep.
Trying to think of what
Gaelic Nox did all of my channel art, including the avatar that you see on the screen. Like, they're an amazing artist and they get back to you pretty fast. They're super reasonable with their rates. Like, they undercharge, I think.
Yeah, they are fabulous.
For how talented they are. Oh, yeah.
Yep. And we are going to get out of here. Should say, Tapioca Weasel, we still have 2 videos and then a surprise with the biblical census videos, with the Lucan census. And so excited to, we don't get anything. They're not affiliate links.
Nope, we're just encouraging people to support the author, because if you buy directly from the publisher, that is the largest percentage that goes to the author. And authors work very, very hard on their work.
Yep.
Yes.
And I know Dr. Ehrman does. So, but we are going to finish that hopefully within the next couple of weeks, just so you know. Mm-hmm. We already have a lot of it made. We are just, we put everything on pause because of really what's been happening in our country over the course of the past month and a half. So that, has been really our focus, not just sitting in our office, but also who we're speaking with, where we're going, what we're doing. So just letting you know that that's going to be the case. We're definitely going to get that back out there, as well as our live shows. Mm-hmm. We are working our way to get back into our Wednesday night 5:30 Pacific shows. We just haven't quite gotten there just yet. So letting you know that. And we are 8 minutes over an hour. So it's definitely time for us to bid everybody. It's, what is it, 11:40 on the East Coast?
Yep, it's almost midnight over there. But thank you for chilling with us for a little bit, and I hope that was a nice educational wind down to that debate for those of you who followed me from over there. Thank you so much for tuning in.
Yep.
Yeah, thank y'all. Y'all have a wonderful evening. We will see y'all later. Bye. You can see there we go.